Hello and welcome back to the podcast that is always up to speed with Formula One here on the Overtime Media Network. This is a bit of a Christmas drop, and it's an interesting episode because we ended, and you and I were just talking about this a couple of minutes ago, Mark, but the season ended late. And for whatever reason, we go into what is normally a bit of a decompression period over the winter break where there's kind of a little bit of a relaxation where a lot of that F1 news and gossip dies down a little bit. But for whatever reason, here we are at Christmas and the news is still coming full force. There's tons of stuff going on. And I think I know where we're probably going to start. But before we do, maybe I'll pass it over to you and check in to see how things are going before we get to this meaty topic. And for those of you that are watching on YouTube, hint, we'll be starting there shortly.
Yeah, you've got your notes all ready to go. Well, it's going, it is the holiday season. Some of us have finally managed to start their vacations a little bit later than planned. But it's all good. It's all good. I'm feeling festive, even though I'm locked away here. I'm not going to be able to get out and obviously visit people this holiday season. So what we're Zooming right now to record this for the YouTube show. But it is what it is. It's 2020. But at least there's a silver lining to this cloud. And I'm not talking about the first story we're going to talk about. But the fact is what you just said, that even though we're just a couple of weeks beyond the end of the season, it's abnormally busy, and that's a good thing because there's plenty of show fodder, and actually a lot of it's really good stuff to talk about. And I guess that is the segue to get right into what we were going to talk about. And I always had this thing, growing up when I was in schools, always doing the homework I liked least, do that one first. If I didn't want to do math or physics or English or French or whatever, I'd always tackle that one first and go on to the ones I liked more later on, and they just got easier as it went on. So the first one, and we were talking about it because we were texting back and forth last night when this it was kind of interesting, and we're talking about the whole Nikita Mazepin saga. He's been reaffirmed by Haas. They dropped a press release earlier today, but it's interesting because you texted me last night saying that it's interesting he deleted his apology from his Insta feed. He also deleted it any reference to being a Haas driver out of his bio, and I think I texted you back the fingered cross emoji. But boy, I was thinking about it when I was checking through social media and the F1 news this morning when I was having my breakfast, and my immediate reaction was, this is not an opportunity missed. This is just the wrong solution, the wrong way to tie this one up, because unfortunately, I mean, it was all over this. The whole focus came on this video that he put on his Instagram feed a couple of weeks ago when he inappropriately touched a woman's on and posted it very briefly, and then it got deleted. I mean, if it was a one-off thing, then okay, maybe there is some wiggle room, if you want to call it that, for rehabilitation and discipline and stuff like that. But unfortunately, this guy has a track record a mile long for questionable and poor and bad decisions and behavior. And like I say, this is not a missed opportunity. This is just the wrong way to go about it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think as well that probably the last week or so, I've been really intensely focused on Twitter and Reddit, looking for any nugget or morsel of information that would kind of suggest that Haas was possibly going to do the right thing. But the Haas camp was very tight-lipped, but for whatever reason, momentum grew on social media over the past couple of days that suggested that they probably were going to do the right thing. And I got excited by that. And now nobody was reporting this. It was simply kind of momentum and energy on social media. But I began to buy into it. And you know what? I started sharing that with you last night that, hey, I think this is going to happen. I think they're going to do the right thing. And again, for Haas, it's the right thing, but it's also short-term financially the most painful thing, because you sever ties with Mazepin, which is absolutely the right thing to do. You also sever ties with who is now your principal financial backer. And I think this is really where this whole situation gets a little bit ugly. And you got to wonder if Mazepin wasn't bringing his father's fortunes to this team and he was just a paid driver, would they have retained him? And I think resoundingly, I think most people would argue that they wouldn't have, that they would have severed those ties. And the other thing I was thinking about last night as well is, as disgusting as this entire situation is, it's also massively overshadowed something that Haas should be celebrated for, which is bringing aboard Mick Schumacher. Like, everything we should be talking about with respect to Haas right now should be favorable and positive. Like, how is his first season going to be? How is he going to compare to his father and his father's first season? Like, what's his ceiling in terms of development? What's his racecraft going to look like in a Formula One car? How is he going to adjust to a Formula One car? We're not talking about that at all. We're not even mentioning his name, because the Mazepin situation is just so awful. And you know what? I'm going to read the Haas F1 statement, because to me it was kind of like a slap in the face. Like, the sense I got from this comment was like, how dare you challenge us? But it reads this: Haas F1 would like to reaffirm that Nikita Mazepin and Mick Schumacher, no one was asking about Mick Schumacher, by the way, but would like to reaffirm that Mazepin and Mick Schumacher will form its driver lineup for the 2021 Formula One Championship season. As per the team's previous statement regarding the actions of Mazepin, bracket December 9th, this matter has been dealt with internally and no further comment shall be made. So I think what we can extract from this is, ultimately, they have no means by which to punish him. Ultimately, his father's backing the team financially. He's going to keep his ride. He's not going to be penalized financially. His contract's not been compromised. He's not going to be out of a seat when it comes to the season. It's just the whole situation is just wrong. And I love your point. Like, it's just wrong. They got this completely wrong. In the spirit of we race as one and social equality, they completely messed this up.
Well, yeah, I mean, it was the first real opportunity to do something about it, and I thought it was very interesting. A lot of the reaction that you saw on social media from a broad spectrum of Formula One fans was the fact that it was well, it's basically the FIA and Formula One had divested themselves of this whole situation and basically said, okay, Haas, it's up to you guys to deal with it. And basically, I think they found themselves painted in the corner, because I was thinking maybe it was a similar type situation that McLaren found themselves in with Honda. Obviously, completely different. But when they had that first opportunity to break that contract with Honda, it cost them $100 million. So I was thinking, obviously, it's a completely different situation. That was a business decision, and this was a decision or a situation they were dealing with for some egregious behavior on a guy that hasn't even stepped and sat in one of their cars yet. So I was thinking perhaps just with like for some things that you mentioned, like the fact that his father is backing the team financially, perhaps it was some big financial penalty to break that contract. It may be just because some unforeseen thing, but I mean, there are a lot of unhappy people out there. And I received an email from, unfortunately, with somebody who's now a former listener, nothing to do what we did. I mean, he was full of praise for the work that we do on the podcast and on the YouTube channel. But it's just I'll just sort of sum it up in a nutshell without, divulging names or anything like that. But this fellow, Formula One fan since the 1960s, and has kind of seen obviously a lot of changes in the sport from this during this time, but he really felt really disgruntled and felt like this whole Mazepin situation was really the straw that kind of broke the camel's back. And basically, well, how can I sit down with my family, with my grandkids or whatever, when you have behavior like this going on, and it's dealt with in publicly, just kind of looks like, I don't want to say it looks like, well, it looks like a slap on the wrist, but the fact that it's all sort of been held or dealt with behind closed doors is almost like a non-resolution to 99.99% of the other people in and around Formula One, right? So I can completely understand that. And it's you can understand why people are upset. It just, like we were saying, it was not a missed opportunity. It was just the wrong or the wrong way to solve this thing. But who knows? We don't know everything that was going on behind the scenes. But it's interesting too, because the first two things that I actually wanted to talk about, just because there's such a juxtaposition between the two stories, was you have Mazepin on one side, and there was actually a Mick Schumacher story out this week. Perhaps Haas felt that they needed to get some positive press out there, and they are actually praising Mick Schumacher for his work ethic and how they found that was like the most impressive thing for him when bringing him into the team for next year. And I'm just like, and to your point, this is the sort of thing that we should be talking about, but the fact that it isn't is just it's just wrong. It's just completely wrong.
You made such a great point as well about the FIA and Formula One effectively deferring to the team. Like, this isn't one of those opportunities where you defer to the team. This is where, as the governing body of global motorsports, or the body that regulates Formula One, like, this is the exact opportunity for you to step in. Like, hey, Haas, we trust you. Make your decision. you made the wrong decision, and now we're going to step in. And the only thing, and again, I'm not rationalizing the decision, trust me. The only conclusion I can draw from this is that Mazepin's father is probably more deeply embedded within this team at a financial level than we probably know.
Mm-hmm.
And I think at this point, there is no separating the two. Like, my sense is that Haas, I feel like Gene Haas, this Formula One experiment hasn't gone as he'd expected. There is no horizon for this team, given everything that we've discussed in terms of the Ferrari power unit. They're not going to bounce back this year. They're probably not going to bounce back next year. I think he was probably looking for a very significant cash injection, and ultimately it was the devil that appeared with a check, and they signed up. And my sense is that there never was going to be a circumstance where they, no matter, even if it's the right thing, I don't think they were ever going to cut him, just because my sense is his family is so deeply embedded within this team that ultimately it would be his father cutting him, and that was never going to happen, because this entire tie-up is to give Mazepin that opportunity. And that listener email is a really interesting one, because this is what I would have expected 5, 6, 8, 10 years ago under the Bernie Ecclestone regime, like this dirty kind of playboy culture with the kind of mistreated, disrespected grid girls, women who were afraid to report from the paddock, women that were afraid to work in the paddock, like frequent mistreatment of women, like this boys club culture, like they'll be like that. It feels dirty. Like, I expected more of Liberty, and Liberty came in, and they made that decision to eliminate grid girls as part of the culture, which was the right thing to do, have grid kids, all that kind of stuff. They introduced We Race as One, although I have some pretty significant issues with that. But this was an inflection point, and like there was only one right answer, and they got the test wrong. FIA, Formula One, they got the test wrong, and I feel like ultimately they were all backed into a corner, because they knew that, hey, if we force Mazepin out, his father leaves and the team probably crumbles, because we probably don't have a buyer on the market, given that it's the COVID pandemic.
Yeah, well, it's very interesting that you should bring that up, because something, a little light bulb just went on in my head. Just kind of thinking, because just a couple of weeks ago you had Mazepin Senior's lawsuit thrown out at the law courts in London, all to do with that whole Racing Point thing, and how basically the way that I'm not exactly sure of the timeline and everything, but basically the way that was that it was framed, that Uralkali or whatever Mazepin father's company was all set to basically snap up Force India out of the hands from the bankrupt Vijay Mallya, and take that one over. But then lo and behold, you had Lawrence Stroll and his consortium swoop in there and pick that one up. And so there was there was that whole process that went through the courts there. So this almost kind of has a feeling now that perhaps this is a plan B, because there has been
totally agree
that speculation about Gene Haas's commitment to Formula One in the long run, right? And I mean, there's been that sort of where there's smoke kind of fire things, or these signals that are they going to be it in for the long term or not? And it kind of makes you wonder now, is this just sort of a foothold for Mazepin to get into Formula One and maybe take this team over from Gene Haas? But like you say, I mean, perhaps that this whole situation is a good indication of how big or how deep the investment and involvement of Mazepin's father is in Haas Formula One. So who knows? It'll probably come out in the wash. But considering we've spent the first 10 or 12 minutes of the show talking about this one, let's just before we go into the break here, let's transition nicely into that story I was just talking about with Mick Schumacher, because like we said, this is the sort of story we should be talking about right now. And obviously he is Formula 2 champion. He's coming into Formula One, huge expectations on his shoulders. But I mean, without even reading too much into the story, I really got the feeling that Mick is a chip off the old block. He's just apple doesn't fall far from the tree thing. Use all the different comparisons you want to. But I mean, that was the one thing, because I mean, his dad, Michael, really changed the game when it came to the way that a Formula One driver approached the sport in terms of fitness, preparation, the way that he interacted and integrated with the engineers and the mechanics and everybody. I mean, he really set the bar for the modern Formula One driver. I mean, I think a lot of us, when you kind of think of what a Formula One driver is, I think there's maybe that flamboyant playboy James Hunt 1970s kind of, you're out drinking and partying and smoking the night before, and you show up to the paddock on Sunday morning, still reeking of booze and and smoke and God only knows what else, and you jump into your overalls and into the car with a hangover and you go and race, right? But I'm exaggerating, obviously, but I mean, Michael really did change, set the bar on that. So it is really going to be interesting, and I really kind of find it kind of eerie too when I see some pictures of Mick. When you see him from a certain angle, it's like, my goodness, he's a spitting image of his old man.
I think you touched on something that we probably all take for granted now, which is the physical and mental work that a modern F1 driver does to prepare to sit in these cars. And part of it is simply because the modern F1 car is so powerful and creates so much G-force that they physically have to spend time in the simulator, in the gym with their trainers, or they simply won't be able to survive a race. But I think you're absolutely right about Michael Schumacher. And I think your story about James Hunt is perfectly apt. Like, if you look at the stereotype of what a Formula One driver was in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, they were out partying the night before the race. They're in the paddock smoking. They've got a beer in their hand. You know what? They're chasing the ladies. Like, it was very much a playboy culture. And they may have been talented drivers, but they weren't putting in any time at the gym. They weren't putting in any time with a therapist. Like, they were showing up on race day. Maybe they were hungover, maybe they weren't, but they would pilot that car and they take it around the track. I think Michael Schumacher is very much like, and I think you can probably draw this comparison with other professional sports as well, that there came a time where all of a sudden the athletes began to value fitness and diet in a way that those that came before them didn't. And I think Michael Schumacher was very much that marker in Formula One, in the sense that his diet, his mental preparedness, his physical preparedness, his intensity was unlike anything I think we'd ever seen in the sport prior. So it doesn't surprise me that his son is tactically taking the same approach. But I think it's also interesting because you talk about the impact of Michael Schumacher on Formula One. Like, his legacy is vast, but there's no driver in the paddock today that isn't devoted to the gym, that doesn't have a full-time trainer, that doesn't have a full-time dietitian. The amount of work that these drivers do off the track relative to what a driver was doing 30 years ago is absurd. Like, these guys may have an off season where they're not racing, but they are doing other forms of motorsports. They're in the simulator, they're in the gym, they're with their trainers. These guys are working 365 days a year. And that started with Michael Schumacher.
Yeah, he really did change the game. And actually, this is a cool kind of time of year from another point or perspective, because I love going through my Instagram feed at this time of year, because, being a cyclist, I love going through and seeing these guys, like in the mountains on their bikes, training hard and stuff like that. And it is pretty cool. But exactly to your point, I mean, it is a 365 day a year job, more or less. There really is very, very little downtime, because I mean, we go and look at guys like Michael Schumacher or Lewis Hamilton or, say, Jenson Button, these guys that have long careers in Formula One. But for every Jenson, every Lewis, every Michael Schumacher, how many guys that are there that just only last a season or two, and then just, they can crack the sport, but they don't last long term. Anyways, time to take a quick break here on the Overtime Media Network. Don't go away. We'll be back in just a moment. All right, well, welcome back to the show. And, well, we still have more Haas news, and it's going to kind of transition into a lot of Ferrari news. And this was an interesting one that popped up earlier this week. And actually, Ferrari is setting up what they call a Haas hub at Maranello, with more of their personnel to be actually move across to the Haas team. And it's very interesting because we were talking about it not so long ago, just the whole the integration and the synergy that you have between Red Bull and Honda. and how we were talking about that with Renault, there really wasn't so much of that. It was basically, here's a Renault power unit, put it in the back of your car. And I kind of get the feeling now too that, and Mercedes is another one where I think there's a lot more, working with the teams. But I kind of get the feeling too that basically when it comes to the Ferrari customer teams, it's very much a couple of crates with power units show up outside like the team factories, and here it is, guys, have at it, put it in. So I thought that was an interesting development, and I just started wondering to myself, is this a more of an indication of some of these changes that we've seen behind the scenes at Ferrari this year, that perhaps they're taking a bit of a different direction when it comes to their customer teams? And I think that there has to be a benefit, not just for the customer teams, but for Ferrari as themselves, to get the feedback from their customer teams, just not on, well, obviously you need that to put their power unit in the back of their car, but just more communication between both parties.
It's interesting because I wasn't expecting this news, but as I started to dig into it, it started making a lot more sense to me. And you and I talked about this, I think a couple of weeks ago on the podcast, where we talked about the salary cap, the financial operating structure of the sport is changing in such a way that some of these bigger teams simply won't be able to carry the personnel, the headcount that they carry today. Fiscally, economically, it just won't work within the cap. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting when I was reading these articles was Binotto himself acknowledged that it's preferable to kind of proactively start moving staff from his team to his customer teams now, as opposed to being in a position where, hey, the cap's implemented, they have to start doing kind of staff cuts. But ultimately, that this is a preemptive move by Ferrari to make sure that the personnel that they would have had to cut anyways end up with a team and not necessarily with a rival team. Because ultimately, if you're going to lose personnel, it's better to lose those personnel to a customer team and help with that migratory process than engineering. I don't know that it's necessarily from the goodness of their heart or it's really a strategic move. It's just, hey, ultimately, we're going to have to adjust our headcount simply due to the economics of the sport. And it's probably better that we help guide some of these folks into our customer teams than it is to potentially lose them on the open market and see them go to a direct competitor.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, with this cost cap and everything, I think it's fascinating because then it becomes almost more like a redistribution of brain power, rather than
Totally.
using these these very qualified and very smart people, rather than them getting a pink slip in their envelope. And it's like, sorry, we had to cut our numbers, but like you say, rather than losing them to Mercedes or to Red Bull or something like that, you're still kind of keeping them, I wouldn't say in in the organization, but you're definitely kind of keeping them in the Ferrari umbrella by sending them over to Haas F1. So that's going to be a very interesting thing. I mean, so he's interesting because he's a very, I'm not exactly sure what the correct term is. I mean, he's definitely quieter. He's not maybe as out there and as outspoken as maybe some of his predecessors like Maurizio Arrivabene. He's a very muted kind of quiet, almost introverted kind of looking guy. And I think maybe sometimes, maybe at least from my perspective, that maybe gives me a different opinion of the way that he goes about and does things, just because I think maybe it's more to do with the fact that he's an engineer by trade. Anyways, Binotto himself, he said that he feels that only a bad situation for the team at Ferrari next year will actually compromise what he's calling a very aggressive focus on the new rules and the new cars that are going to come in 2022. And I think that that next year, and you said a little bit earlier in the show, that it's going to be difficult for the Ferrari, for the works team and also for the customer teams to really rebound, because we're going into a very, very strange year in 2021, where we kind of have like this, another this sort of prolonging of the current formula, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I don't think that at all. But it's just kind of keeping the seat warm, because we were expecting these brand new cars coming in 2021 and all these different things. And then because of COVID and the really tight timelines to get these cars actually on the track for next year, just wasn't going to happen because of the shutdown that we had. So it's going to be very peculiar, but you can tell that just from this quote and similar things that he said over the weeks and months over the course of this season, that's where they're really really focusing towards is really nailing it for 2022. And I think they've got a lot riding on it, because I wouldn't I don't think, obviously, that they've fallen off the edge as drastically and as quickly as, say, McLaren or Williams, but I think that they they've dropped off enough to realize that it's a massive wake up call. Thinking, to realize, okay, well, we were what were they, second in the constructors champion 4 out of 5 years or whatever it was in the turbo hybrid era, and now they weren't in the top three, whatever. I might have misspoken on some of those stats,
Top
but
five.
so yeah, so I mean, they're not even the top five now. So the prospects, I think, for them to climb back into the top, well, I think maybe top five is doable, but top three, I think, is going to be extremely difficult for them next year. And I think they found themselves in a position that once you kind of lose that edge, that to play catch up in this modern era of Formula One is extremely difficult. So I don't want to say they've really washed their hands of 2021. I think they're going to try and take the lessons that they've learned over the course of this year, and I think they will improve. But I think that 2022 is just going to become all that more crucial for them to really get back to where they want to be.
If I was a gambling man, I don't gamble, and I often think about maybe I should, although I assume I would be pretty bad at it. I really try to think about where I would put Ferrari next year. If I was looking at the over under on kind of Bonotto's prediction that they'd finish third in the championship, I don't think that's a bet that I would take. I think for sure we're going to see some incremental improvement next year. I wonder what the Aston Martin's team is going to look like when they adjust to Sebastian Vettel being in that seat. I think McLaren's in a position where they could conceivably take a step back next year. I don't necessarily think that it's going to be a smooth transition as they migrate from a Renault power unit into a Mercedes power unit. So I think there's going to be some points available. I just think third place in the Constructors' Championship is pretty ambitious. That said, though, I also don't think Bonotto or anyone from a leadership capacity on the Ferrari team can really say anything else, right? You can't go and publicly exclaim that, hey, we Ferrari would be happy if we finished in the top five. I mean, realistically, if they said one or two, they would probably be laughed at hysterically by anyone in the media. But I think they kind of have to say third. Like I said, I think there's going to be some points available to them next year that maybe weren't available this year. But I think they are right to focus on 2022. I think anything they pick up next year is going to be gravy. Ultimately, the way the prize money and the operating income of Formula One is distributed amongst the teams, they don't necessarily have to be that competitive to cash in a meaningful way. But ultimately, I think they're targeting 2022, and I think that's probably the right thing for them. And if next year's kind of a transition year, especially as you're bringing in Carlos Sainz and getting him familiar with the team and his engineers and the car and all those kind of pieces, I think whatever they can achieve next year is gravy. But I think you're absolutely right. And Bonotto's ultimately right as well, that 2022 has to be the year that they're in a position to put a much more competitive car on the track. And it also gives them another year to regain some of the power that they lost in that power unit after the FIA findings in 2019.
It's also very interesting too, just listening to what Mattia Bonotto's been saying this week, is because we're going into this weird, new world, and you have this development token system. So each team gets 2 development tokens that they can use. But some of the teams that they found themselves running more closely this year, like AlphaTauri and Racing Points, they have customer was it suspension and gearboxes. So since they're running those customer components, those actually fall in kind of a loophole, and they don't need to spend any tokens on that. So they might be able to upgrade those without being penalized. So I think that they're quite aware that they might have some significant challenges next year. But to your point exactly, they're not going to come out and say anything else, because they don't want to obviously admit that that they're resigned to being where they are. But I think they're very aware that that it's going to be a very, very difficult year for them. And honestly, I think Formula One needs a strong Ferrari team. I mean, they are the world's most famous racing team, and it's not a good look for them. Like we we talked about many times over the course of the season that at one point they were closer to Williams in terms of pace than they were to Mercedes, who were there not that long ago on a fairly even, well, maybe not even, but they were very close to them in terms of pace. So I mean, the fall off that edge of the cliff for Ferrari was very dramatic, and yeah, there's a lot riding on it for 2022. Anyways, time for another break here on the Overtime Media Network. We're going to come back in a moment, and we're going to talk about Ferrari. So don't go away. We'll be back in just a moment. All right. Well, welcome back to the show, and welcome to all of you listening on the podcast or watching on YouTube. And Mark, we've been talking quite a bit about Ferrari for the last, good portion of the last segment. And yeah, so just moving along from the development part of it, the one thing I think that's kind of smart, just from a marketing point of view, that they've actually set a date and a time, basically, and they've also named the car for next year, the SF21, and they're going to unveil the car just before the preseason testing in Barcelona. And I think it makes a good deal of sense. I think it makes sense to be organized. Ultimately, it has no effect on whether or not this is going to be a competitive car on the track and what kind of season they're going to have. But I think that just from an organizational point of view, I think it's a smart thing to do. I mean, it's quite the opposite. Naming a date and a time, and the name of your 2021 car this far out, compared to Williams, what was it, in 2019, where they were basically running from the airport with parts falling out of carry-on luggage, and a day late and $1 short.
You also made and I don't mean to backtrack, but you just made a really great point about the importance of Ferrari to Formula One. And, I talked last week and probably the week before and probably every week before that about the fact that Lewis Hamilton's kind of unique because he's this transcendent talent that is bigger than the sport itself. Ferrari as a team is that from a team basis. There's no team that transcends the sport like Ferrari does. And I think it's ultimately important for the short-term, medium-term, and long-term health of the sport to have a competitive Ferrari. And the way I see Ferrari in terms of their importance to Formula One is they're very much like a Man City or a Man United of the Premiership. They're very much the New York Yankees or the Los Angeles Dodgers or the Los Angeles Lakers of Major League Baseball or the NBA, that these leagues can succeed, but the product is much, much, much more compelling when your platinum premier teams or I would say organizations are successful. And I think it's ultimately going to be a good thing. I thought it was really interesting as well. And I went back and looked, and I couldn't find, looking at the last 5-6 years, at least the turbo hybrid era, any example of a team introducing a car model number or a car name this far in advance, which tells me that they've probably put a pretty significant amount of energy into developing this car already. And I think obviously they needed to based on their results of 2020, but I think that they're probably farther ahead of most teams in terms of 2021 developments. And I think this was probably also a bit of a marketing ploy as well, that, hey, look at us. This is how far we are along that 2021 pathway. The other comment that I would add as well is Ferrari had made some comments recently about the fact that they've had their 2021 power unit on the dyno a couple of times. And they kind of alluded to this in late September. They alluded to it again in early November, and they've alluded to it again now. And they're suggesting that the power gains that they're seeing out of the 2021 power unit are pretty substantial. And not that they're at parity with 2019 yet, but significantly better than 2020. So I think things are looking good. And I think this is a bit of a marketing ploy to be able to come out and introduce your reveal date and your model number and have a teaser banner this far in advance is pretty good. But again, ultimately, it's just good for the sport because Formula One needs to have a good Ferrari team, both for Ferrari fans and non-Ferrari fans. It's good to cheer for them. It's good to cheer against them. And I think ultimately, if we want to see the sport continue to nurture the hinterlands of the sport, which is some of these traditional Western European markets, like you and I have talked about this so many times, like I don't think there's a race that exudes energy and atmosphere more than more than Monza or potentially a Mugello or an Imola. Like the scenes that we see in that Charles Leclerc victory in 29, like that still gives me goosebumps. And I'm not a Charles Leclerc fan. I'm not a Formula One fan, but that scene was epic, and we need more of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And more to your point, how it's more of like a marketing ploy. What it does is it's effectively Ferrari going back and taking control of the narrative in a season when they got so much negative press. Right? People were talking about Ferrari for the wrong reasons. They're slow. They didn't treat Sebastian Vettel right by not giving him a new phone call or a new contract and letting him go by phone, and just being so far down in the pack and all these different things. So what you see is them slowly getting control of the narrative and going into the season. And if the new power unit turns out to have these substantial games like you're talking about, then that puts them in a good position for the year. So maybe they get closer back to where they were a couple of years ago, where they're fighting it more out with Red Bull and maybe McLaren, next year, if they can keep up their form, and Red Bull, rather than being stuck in the middle where like they were this year. With the exception of a couple of races. I mean, they looked very good in Turkey for some odd reason, but the fact of the matter is this year's car was too slow. It had an underpowered engine in there for obvious reasons, because of all the drama and whatever that transgression that was uncovered this time last year. And the car was just aerodynamically was too draggy. So I mean, they said they've learned a lot of little things over the course of 2020 that they've been able to learn from, to apply and put it into the car for next year. So it's interesting. And it is kind of funny. It is, Ferrari is one of those teams that does transcend the sport. People might not know a lot about Formula One, but they know about Ferrari. And I always get the feeling too that Ferrari, it's one of those teams that a lot of people love them, but the people that don't love Ferrari, they don't like them at all. It's really kind of interesting, despite all the history and despite all the achievements. It's one of those teams that they have like vast legions of fans, but the people don't call themselves Ferrari fans, are very, very far off from liking them. But just before we switch over and talk a little bit about Mercedes, so they were actually saying this week that Charles and Carlos Sainz are free to race each other next year. What's your take on that? I think that's interesting.
I would like to see that in practice before I buy too much into that. I think if you look back at 2019 in particular, there was some very high profile clashes between Vettel and Charles Leclerc in his first team, or in his first year with Ferrari. And I think there was a commitment and there was promises made during the offseason leading from 2018 into 2019 at that point that ultimately these drivers will be free to race. And ultimately, I think what we ended up seeing was a constant clash of team strategy and team orders and driver personalities and driver ego. And it really devolved into an unfortunately complicated situation at a personnel level for Ferrari. It was great storylines, and it was amazing to talk about those on track clashes and the fact that they were disregarding team orders and things like that. But ultimately, it could also just speak to the fact that they probably maybe have supreme confidence in Charles Leclerc, and ultimately recognize that they probably don't need to impose team orders because maybe Carlos Sainz won't be that close anyway. So they don't even need to kind of start talking about that. But I think it'll be interesting, to be totally honest.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I think so too. I think it's going to be a great leveler, because I think we'll finally see what Carlos Sainz is really made of. I mean, he's arguably moving to a top team, so I mean, whether or not they can deliver that top level performance car remains to be seen. But we know what who and what Charles Leclerc is. I mean, he's demonstrated that to us in his first couple of years in Formula One, and for me, Carlos Sainz he's been a bit of a question mark. I mean, we've certainly seen some very good moments from him, but I mean, this is a guy that was at Alpha. I was going to say Alpha Tauri, Toro Rosso, and then Renault, and then moving over to to McLaren. So I mean, he's kind of had a couple of stops in his career, from a junior team to some teams that have sort of been kind of stuck in a little bit of a funny spot in the middle of the pack there. So I think that's the one thing that maybe they know something we already don't, in terms of Leclerc v Sainz. And I think that's what is going to be really interesting to see, how close these guys are in terms of pace.
Do you think, and I'll ask this because it just came to mind right now, do you think in a lot of ways that this could be strategically Ferrari's Bottas? You know what? He's a good guy. He's a good personality. He's a good team player. But ultimately, he maybe just understands his role within that team, and he's not going to create unnecessary friction with Charles Leclerc. Because you're right. Like, if you look at his career, he's not been bad, but he's bounced around to a bunch of teams in a relatively short amount of time. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it was always a surprise, and it was a surprise to me that Ferrari pursued him in the way that they did. And I ultimately wonder if they're looking at him because he's simply a safe bet. He's good enough that he can probably cash in some podiums and rake up some points, but ultimately will allow Charles Leclerc to do his thing undisturbed.
Yeah, well, you know, it's interesting because, I mean, Leclerc going to Ferrari was really the great disturber. I mean, here we go. You get like a young guy going into Ferrari, to a team that typically never gave a shot to really young drivers like that. And the one, you know, that really upset things, because it was apparent right from the beginning that he was as quick as, if not quicker than, Sebastian Vettel. And then that answer was presented pretty quickly. Where is he in terms of Sebastian Vettel? But if you kind of dial it back a little bit earlier to the Vettel Raikkonen era of Ferrari, it was ideal if you were Sebastian Vettel, because you could go out and do your thing, and even though your teammate was fairly close to you in terms of pace, he was just naturally that much quicker, just that little bit quicker than Kimi Raikkonen, that Raikkonen, even at his his best, just wasn't able to push Sebastian Vettel. But then you had Charles Leclerc come in once Raikkonen left the team and went over to Alpha. I mean, that completely got flipped on its head, and Charles came in and pretty much right from the beginning was trying to push his way around Sebastian Vettel. I mean, look at Bahrain that year, that when he should have won that race, that they told him to stay behind Seb, and how long did he last behind him? Half a lap, 1 lap, 2 laps. It wasn't very long, and then he just pushed his way through. And I mean, he should have won that race. And I mean, he was fortunate that he got on the podium, but that was only because of that bizarre double DNF, when you had literally both Renaults fail at the exact same moment, which was a very, very strange thing. But yeah, it's going to be an interesting situation. But like you say, Carlos Sainz for Charles Leclerc might just be, like you say, that safe bet, that one guy that's going to come in. And the thing is, too, very much like Valtteri Bottas, I mean, Carlos Sainz, he isn't a very outspoken, very flamboyant, kind of like say whatever is on your mind if you're unhappy. He's not going to really rock the boat. And I don't mean that he's kind of a passive kind of guy that's going to sit back and just kind of take a load of crap thrown at him, but I don't really get the feeling that, I mean, publicly he's not that kind of guy. But certainly it's a fascinating lineup that they have for next year. I mean, they've completely reversed their ethos when they never had like a lot of young drivers, gave them their shot. Now they got 2 pretty young drivers in that team.
Yeah, and Carlos is on a 1-year deal as well. And you and I talked about this last week. I think the other thing that we need to really consider here is one, and I don't know how you're necessarily going to judge the progress and the development of Mick Schumacher simply because he's going to be driving such an uncompetitive car. But my sense is that Ferrari wouldn't be funding his development, and they wouldn't be nurturing him in the way that they have if they didn't have designs on him being with that team, right? Like the ultimate marketing campaign is to get Mick Schumacher into a Ferrari. And I think that's the end goal. I just don't know how long that's necessarily going to take. Ultimately, he was successful in Formula 2 this year. He won some races. It was definitely his best open wheel campaign yet. But I don't know that you leave him with Haas for 2 or 3 or 4 years, because I don't know how much he's going to learn in that role. And I think we've talked a lot about, hey, have Mercedes left George Russell in the Williams team too long? And at what point do they stop developing as a driver and just start to become a little bit disengaged and unhappy and start shopping for other opportunities? Like for me, like if I'm Ferrari, ultimately, I have designs on getting Mick Schumacher into my car sooner rather than later, unless he proves to be an unmitigated disaster in Formula One and he's clearly off the pace and he's trailing Mazepin in qualifying and practice and all those kind of things. Like if he is 80% of what Carlos Sainz is, my sense is that Ferrari is going to want to make that move. And we talked about this as well, that if I'm Carlos, I probably have I probably have the understanding that my stay at Ferrari probably isn't going to be a long one. Like this is a 1 year, this is a 2 year stint, because if Mick's successful in Haas, you've got to think that for the marketing opportunities alone, Ferrari has to have designs on migrating him into that seat.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great point that, Carlos being on that 1 year deal is just, I don't want to say that he's like basically a seat warmer. I don't think that's necessarily a very, like just or fair way to classify it. But certainly when you have a guy with, the pedigree and the hopes that they have and the potential of a Mick Schumacher, then really it does come down to it. How if he turns out to be what they think and what he hope he's going to be, for many different reasons, then it becomes a question of time. It's like, what is that sort of sweet spot? Do you leave him in there for 1 year or 2 years? And then you got to find like that Goldilocks zone of what is that right amount of time, or else it becomes counterproductive. And very much to the point that we had on this very discussion about George Russell and Valtteri Bottas. Like, if you're Toto Wolff and you're Mercedes, you at some point you got to start thinking about the future of that team, because Bottas isn't a young driver. I mean, he's not over the hill by any means, but he's not going to be the future of that team. That in 2 years, Lewis Hamilton says, you know what, guys, I'm hanging up my helmet and my racing gloves, and I'm going off to pursue all these myriad of other interests and things that I want to do with my life. I don't think for a number of reasons that Valtteri Bottas is the guy that you want to elevate and put into that number one seat at Ferrari. And it really makes an interesting topic or thought that you have Charles Leclerc, who obviously is a top level Formula One driver this at such a young age and such an early point in his career. If Mick Schumacher pans out to be what we hope he's going to develop, what is that dynamic at Ferrari going to look like in a couple of years if you have these two guys, these two young rock stars, going back and forth? That could be one interesting situation to take a look at. So it's going to be fun to watch and see how it develops on both sides of this coin. All right. Well, Mark, let's take one final break here. And then, there's a bunch of Mercedes and Red Bull things to talk about. So we'll get into that just on the other side of the break here on the Overtime Media Network. So don't go away. We'll be back on just the flip side here in a couple of seconds. All right. Well, welcome back to the show. And as we start to wrap it up, there's certainly no shortage of things to talk about. The big one for Mercedes this week, team principal Toto Wolff will continue to serve as a team principal for the next 3 years. Lewis Hamilton is really happy about that. He said that Toto is what he called a great figurehead. And I think that this was just one of those deals that really needed to get done. Toto says that he feels like he should be a part of the team, a part of Mercedes forever, and he's committed to for life, which is an interesting thing. And again, if you are not Lewis Hamilton, if you're not Mercedes, and if you're not Toto Wolff, if basically you're everybody else in Formula One, you've got to be a little bit kind of nervous about this, because unless these guys completely lose the plot, Formula One is basically, the season is there to lose. I mean, if they're able to perpetuate what they've been doing, I mean, Toto was obviously set the bar there very, very high off the track. Lewis has set the bar very, very high on the track, and you have these ingredients there that have delivered so much success. They're still to deliver potentially more success in the future.
I gotta think that the momentum towards this signing really began in earnest back in the spring. And if you'll recall, it was reported that Toto had invested a fairly significant amount of cash, probably about 30 million US dollars, 45 million Canadian dollars, into the Racing Point project. And I think at that point, the media and social media went into this frenzy. And I think people began asking that question, is that potentially going to be his end destination? And I think what this kind of announcement does today is it really, to your point, one, it cements his future, at least for the next 3 seasons with Mercedes. but I think it goes a long way to cementing Mercedes's commitment to the sport as well. And I'll be very honest, if I'm Mercedes, this is a great marketing exercise for us. We're probably not earning a lot because we're doing a really good job of reinvesting all of our earnings from the F1 project back into the F1 team and into the operations of the power unit creation. So I think it's a really great marketing exercise. But I think ultimately Mercedes could take it or leave it at a board level. If you don't have Toto Wolff, if you don't have Lewis Hamilton, you know what, you could wrap this up. You could sell off whatever your remaining shares are. But my sense is that if you have Toto Wolff, I think it reinvigorates Daimler's investment, at least emotionally, in this team. But I think, and you and I talked about this a couple of times the last couple of weeks, is what's the holdup with Lewis? What's the holdup with Lewis? And you got to think that Lewis was waiting to see how this played out as well. Obviously, he's very, very close to Toto. Toto's been a big part of his experience with Mercedes. They've shared every championship celebration together since 2014. Toto wasn't obviously a part of the team that brought Lewis to Mercedes, but ultimately the two have clearly grown very, very close. And my suspicion is that the Hamilton contract will probably happen in pretty short order. And I think you and I talked about this as well. My sense is that it's probably going to be a 1 or a 2 or a 3-year deal, but there'll be driver options. And I think Hamilton will probably be reinvigorated a little bit by this as well, because I think he was a little bit uncertain about Toto's future with the team, at least as a team principal and a CEO. But I think this is a great move because I think it cements Mercedes' immediate future in the sport. And maybe it's terrible for all of the other teams, but I think, you know what, as devastating as this team can be to the sport in terms of their dominance, the sport also needs the team because they're producing power units for how many different squads on the track right now? Like, ultimately, if they were to leave the sport, it would create a massive power vacuum, and you would have teams like McLaren and teams like Williams and teams like Aston Martin. I got to start saying Aston Martin, not Racing Point anymore.
Right.
That would be devoid of a power unit. Like, as bad as they are for the sport, perception wise, in terms of their dominance, the sport also needs them because they're driving so much value to the other teams. So I thought this was awesome news. It shuts down any ongoing rumors about him going to Aston Martin. And I think it's going to hastily bring a Hamilton contract as well.
Yeah, you stole the words right out of my mouth, because when I saw the news today that Toto had re-signed for 3 years, my immediate thought was, well, how soon does the Hamilton extension get announced? You got to think that it's coming. And I think that it will get done for a number of reasons. And I don't think that by any means that if the Toto left and somebody else came in, that they would do not a good of a job or a professional job. But if you're Lewis, at this point in your career where you own so many records, and you could walk away away from the sport on your own terms and go and pursue whatever you want to do in your life, that would you really want to kind of rebuild those or build a new relationship with a brand new team principal
Exactly.
I mean,
exactly.
he can go off now and concentrate on what he wants to do for next year and the next couple of years, whatever the term of this contract is going to be. And maybe win this 8th, 9th, maybe a 10th world championship. Who knows, right? But I think that that maybe if Toto didn't come back, maybe this doesn't happen. And so I think from a broader picture, I think it's definitely a very good thing. Did you also see the story, the quote from Lewis this week, where he was saying that the mistakes that he had regarding the various penalties he had, like at Monza going into the pit lane when it was closed, the that one in Russia for the practice starts, those aren't going to happen next year. And I always think that every time that something like that or some issue on the track happens to Mercedes, just in general, doesn't matter if it's Lewis or the team in general, they go away and they focus. And then not only do they get over these issues, these gremlins, whatever they might be, they come back and they're even better than before. It's just like a couple of years ago when they had that disastrous outing at Monza. And where did Lewis finish? He finished like 7th or 8th or something like that. It was a terrible weekend for them. And they went back and they had those couple of weeks between Monaco and Canada. I think I said Monaco. Did I say Monza? If I said Monza, that's just me. Anyways, they spent that 2 weeks between Monaco and Canada sorting out the gremlins. They get to Montreal, and it was like Monaco had never happened. They were right back to where they should be, but they were even better than they were before. And whenever I hear anything like that, I always think it's kind of like a shot across the bow that if you're not Lewis Hamilton, you got to be worried about hearing something like that.
Do you remember, and I'm sure you do, but I think this is a great reference point as well. Back at Germany in 2019, which was
the wet race.
was a festive, yeah, the wet race. And you had the entire Netflix crew there. This is the one race that they were going to have access to the Mercedes team. So for those of you that aren't aware, and if you have seen the Netflix Formula One program, you'll probably have noticed that, especially in the first season, there was a pretty distinct absence of Ferrari and Mercedes, and it ultimately came down to the fact that those two teams didn't want to give up a competitive kind of advantage by allowing the cameras into their pits, into the garage, and around the team, et cetera, et cetera. But in 2019, Mercedes had agreed that the Netflix crew could be a part of a single race, and it just so happened to be Germany, where they were wearing their special livery and had a special livery painted on the car, et cetera, et cetera. But it was ultimately a catastrophic race. And again, the weather worked against them, but Bottas had a terrible spill. Hamilton had a spill. He cut a corner to go into the pits. He got penalized. He wanted to tap out of the race. He still finished and got in the points. But it was funny because they moved past that weekend so quickly. It was startling. Like the fact that they were able to put that weekend behind them so quickly was amazing. And I think from that race, there was a ton of learnings as well, just in terms of, how we prepare for a wet race and how we react to different types of situations that would come up. But I think any other team that would have encountered that type of weekend under those circumstances with that amount of media pressure probably would have suffered for a few weeks. But ultimately, they just shrugged it off and moved on. You're absolutely right. They learn so quickly from the few mistakes that they do make.
Yeah, it really is a fascinating phenomena that you see with the Mercedes, just their mental fortitude and their mental strength whenever they have bad races or bad weekends, whatever it might be. Whereas it seems where it might be somebody else that they kind of go into a bit of a funk and there's a bit of a hangover. But it's amazing that they're able to put these sort of weekends behind them and then just emerge even stronger on the other side, which is always bad for the other 9 teams in the paddock. Speaking of which,
and I would just mention as well that, and just because we're talking about Toto Wolff, I ultimately think that's very much a leadership thing, right? Yeah. I think oftentimes when you see a disastrous mistake, whether it's in the pit lane or it's in the garage or it's a strategy decision, sometimes these things bubble up to the surface and we can hear about the disputes in public, but I think oftentimes we don't. But I think sometimes these devolve into really, really significant disputes within the team, and it can tear teams apart. And I think from a leadership perspective, I just think Toto does such a great job of managing that entire operation that when something does go wrong, he's able to manage it, and he's able to manage the personalities, and he's able to move the team on. Whereas in a lot of teams, these things continue to simmer. If I'm a driver and an engineer makes a mistake that costs me points, or there's a strategy error with the team, or ultimately there's team orders that cost me a position in the race, like these are things that can start tearing and fraying at kind of the social fabric of a team. But I just think Toto Wolff's leadership is such that he never allows that to happen. He just never allows it to happen. And that speaks to their consistency and their dominance over the last 7 years.
Yeah, it absolutely comes down to leadership. I agree with you 100%. And that's why I think the last couple of stories that I wanted to talk about involving not Mercedes, but Red Bull are very interesting. The first one was Hamilton's comment this week about Sergio Perez joining Red Bull for 2021 makes them a much stronger team. And I think that very much like we were saying last week or the week before, when this whole Sergio Perez to Red Bull was more of a rumor rather than a confirmed fact, that they now have that 1-2 punch where you have your out and out number one, your race challenger, title contender Max Verstappen, but you now have a very capable number 2 driver. Now, whether or not that will parlay itself into a legitimate contender to Mercedes for next year. That kind of leads into the comments that was made by Christian Horner, team principal at Red Bull, who says that they need to deliver a car that's going to be a great all-rounder for next year. Because I know that this year was obviously a bit of an anomaly due to the fact that we had this shutdown, we had the delayed start to the season. But it was interesting that even before COVID, like before this became a thing, and everything got shut down, we had lockdowns everywhere. That even before the start to the season, when it should have got off the ground back in March, Christian Horner was saying that Red Bull going into 2020 was the most prepared that he'd ever seen the team. And then when it got to the actual season itself, it didn't really translate into performance on the track. I mean, Mercedes was just that much better. And I mean, it's a little bit sort of speculative, to try and figure out where that difference was. But certainly what he said then didn't really translate into results on the track very much this year. But what he's saying now is very much spot on, because if these two guys aren't able to go out and challenge Mercedes and push them next year, and or ultimately finish higher up in the championship than where they finished this year, even if it's still runner up, it's not going to come down to your driver lineup. It's going to come down to, what they got strapped onto themselves.
I got to think that if I was going to bet on what, and you know what, before I say this, let me backtrack a little bit. If you look at the constructor standings for 2020, Mercedes ran away with it. They scored 573 points to Red Bull, who scored 319 points. That's a 250 point delta. It's pretty significant.
It's huge.
But when you start to unpack the circumstances around the season, Mercedes had a lot of luck. They had a single retirement in the entire season. Red Bull had a ton of bad luck. They had 6 retirements, and almost all of those were poor Verstappen. So Verstappen, who's your key driver and who's most likely to cash in on points, had consistent mechanical issues. And we even saw him towards the end of the season get tied up with Leclerc, and he lost his opportunity to score points. And others, they had a lot of bad luck. So if things break differently for Red Bull this year, so consider the fact that they can cut their retirements in half. So, hey, maybe we have 3 retirements instead of 6, and maybe Mercedes has a little less luck and they have a couple of additional retirements. And then all of a sudden you stack in the second driver who, I think by any measure, is a more competitive driver than is Alex Albon. Suddenly you're in a position over a 23 race calendar where maybe that gap starts to shrink a little bit. Like I can't imagine a scenario next year where the gap's going to be this big. One, Red Bull had a lot of bad luck this year. Alex Albon underperformed. Mercedes had a ton of luck this year. No retirements. Well, 1 retirement, like everything kind of broke in their favor. And I just think things will probably balance out a little bit more next year, especially over the balance of a 23 race calendar. The other thing that we'll probably see, probably by early spring, is that most of the drivers will be vaccinated. I would assume that an awful lot of the drivers will be vaccinated by the time we get to Australia. In fact, it could be an FIA requirement at that point. And ultimately, I don't think we're going to see drivers like Sergio Perez miss 2 races. So I would expect that Mercedes is still going to win next year, but I would expect that gap to shrink considerably. And you and I talked about this as well. I think Honda, knowing that it's their last year in the sport, is going to go all in, and they're going to throw the kitchen sink at that team in terms of financial resources because they want to go out with a bang as well. But I would suggest that 250 point deficit is going to shrink considerably.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And the whole Sergio Perez thing to Red Bull, it's kind of a feel good story, because I was feeling really bad for the guy that pro sports and the Shark Tank that it can be, notwithstanding that it just didn't feel right that when the musical chairs stopped, that he was the one guy that was without a seat. So I mean, ultimately at the end of the day, I mean, he's worked out really well for him, and I really hope that they get a good and competitive car for him next year, and for Max Verstappen as well, because they've been in this funny kind of situation as well, is that they've obviously closed the gap and surpassed the gap with Ferrari. They're now trying to close that gap to Mercedes, which is no easy feat. So that is one of the fascinating things to look for next year. But certainly, like, it's true. I was just thinking when you were saying that if they have less reliability issues and Mercedes has more, I was kind of thinking, yeah, well, it doesn't really happen all that much, for Mercedes. But you do when they do it, it's sort of in races you wouldn't expect, like we saw in Austria that one year, or in
Yeah.
2016 when the big end went on Lewis's car, which ultimately basically cost him the
Malaysia.
championship
Yep.
that year. Yeah, sorry, in Malaysia. And then also when you think about it this year, the two races that you didn't really expect that they have trouble with tires was Silverstone. I mean,
Yeah.
I know
So
that
true.
especially that track. I know that that they're racing at Silverstone this summer, so I know that you get the elevated track temperatures and stuff like that. So I mean, they are not immune to it. So it would be it really it's sort of a really tantalizing prospect that if Red Bull can improve the car, Honda gives them an even better power unit for next year. That it really makes me salivate to see the prospect of these teams fighting a lot more closely together. And who knows? We'll have to sit patiently. I mean, we're now what 90 something days until the first race, so I mean it's still a ways
It's
off, but
It's also probably not too early to start planning the season preview show. And it's funny because I wasn't actually excited about Red Bull until we started talking about it. And like, this could be a really like a really compelling storyline for 2021. And now I'm starting to chomp at the bit to get our season preview done because, to your point, like the season's going to come so fast, right? But yeah, it should be really, really good. And I can't wait. I can't wait till we get to that season preview show and I get to hear who your top three are. Because I have an idea of who my top three is going to be, but I can't wait to hear what yours is going to be.
well, even more to that point, it's going to be interesting to see when we get to preseason testing. I mean,
Oh
obviously, there's a
yeah,
lot of they're shaking down the cars and everything like that. But once they get to the end of the testing sessions, and they've got things figured out, and they're as close to race trim as possible, that when we see some of these final times, to see how they sort of match up. I mean, sometimes you get like these false indicators, like we saw with the Ferrari that one year. Oh, they're a second and a half faster than Mercedes, and then of course you get to Australia, and it just didn't turn out to
yeah,
be
yeah.
more than a flash in the pan in winter testing. So I've got a couple of things. I'm not going to divulge it now because we have to keep these things to talk about
Of course.
at the proper time. But there are so many great things to watch over the winter and see how they develop, and especially going into 2021. And like we were saying earlier in the show, despite the fact that it is going to be this sort of in between season, there's so many great things to keep a lookout for. I mean, yeah, I mean, there's a whole list. We could probably cut this show off and start a new one right here. But perhaps, in the spirit of the season, perhaps we should be giving, and rather than, well, I guess we're taking if we're cutting it off at this point. But maybe we're giving the gift of less of us until next week.
Oh God.
Yeah. And so on that note, well, thank you all very much for downloading, watching, listening to the show on behalf of myself and from Mark. Happy, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. Well, we'll be back next year before New Year's. Enjoy the holidays, stay safe, and I hope there's a lot of Formula One themed presents under the Christmas trees on Christmas morning. Anyways, if you want to get in touch, as always, do so on Twitter at Scuderia F1 Pod, at the email at Scuderia F1 Pod at gmail.com. And that's it. That's a wrap. Merry Christmas from both of us. Bye for now, and we'll talk to you next week.